We're getting some really good questions in on Slido, so thank you very much for those. We'll come to some of those in a second, because some of them are very pertinent, but I'll just kick us off, really. So we'll start off at the beginning, RIS1. We're coming to the end of it now. Obviously, there's a chance to have a look at, there was a lot of over-promising, wasn't there, about the number of schemes that potentially could be achieved and the kind of cost it would be done for and all the rest of it. Steve, first of all, do you think it was inevitable that that kind of big wish list at the start of RIS1, when it was all new and all happening really quickly, was never really going to happen? It wasn't a realistic wish list.
Well, I don't really think of it as a wish list. It was definitely a set of schemes that ministers wanted to go ahead and which the agency, as was, had developed up to a certain point. What I would say, though, is the run-up to creating Highways England basically encompassed what happens in a normal privatised industry regulatory review cycle over 5 years, compressed into one. And we took the view, I chaired the project board jointly with Colin Matthews, we took the view that there were various aspects of the framework we were bound to have got wrong in the course of doing this at such pace. But the prize was too good to give up. And the prize was to move to the new framework that had the new organisations involved and the arm's length body and the certainty that came with it. And we all had to be a bit grown up about the extent to which some things, some scope for change would need to be built in. Now, what has been developed subsequently over the course of RIS1 has been the change control process between Highways England, the ORR and the department, which means, yes, the start point of some schemes has gone back, but it's gone back in the context of a very clear customer decision from the department about the implications, and frankly, as a road user, to create a better programme, a better balanced programme that doesn't involve quite so many roads being worked on at the same time in the same place.
Anthony, do you think that they'll learn quickly from this? Because, I've covered the railway for years. You've done a lot on the rails. What we've seen with the railways over many years is the sort of list of projects that slip, that get moved, that get changed, they're political footballs. Do you think the same thing, there's a risk the same thing would happen with roads, or do you think it's going to be better than that?
I think that risk is always there, as Steve says, because you get a huge increase in work going on, a huge increase in money being spent, which inevitably puts pressures on costs and skills and the willingness of the country to be experimented on with almost perpetual kind of Orwellian roadworks going on at all times a day. There is a limit to what you can do, because I think there's sometimes a slight habit that the engineers say, we'll finish that section, then we'll move on to that bit, it'll be great. And as a user, you think, oh God, no, just stop doing it. And I think some of the techniques that were being used in terms of very long sections of roadworks with very narrow lanes, users found really, really uncomfortable. Going at 50 miles an hour, a foot away from an HGV in a very narrow lane for 30 miles is really unpleasant as a user, and I think the learning just needs to be fed through very clearly. But it is early days. We've not done this before. This is all new. Having this amount of money is new. It's quite exciting, but the key thing is just to keep learning and banking those early successes and keeping the feedback loop going from the users the whole time is absolutely crucial to see where users are in all this.
Yeah, I know what you'll say about this, but do you feel that feedback is getting significantly better now?
Yes, it's being listened to, and I think the top team at Highways England get it. I think there's probably more work to do further in the organisation and with contractors, but once it's built into the regulatory framework, if it is, it's kind of hardwired in, as it should be. Listen to your users, act on what they're saying, and you've got to keep that satisfaction at a certain level, or even better, above.
John, can we talk money and talk savings? Because there seems to be a bit of a disparity between what Highways England think they're achieving in terms of efficiencies and savings and what you guys think. Could you give us a bit more detail on that? Where do you come from it, and what do they say?
Yeah, sure. I think some of this does come back to how the efficiency measures were set up at the time, to be frank about this, because everyone's learnt lessons from RIS1. It was new. It was novel. And some of the elements were very novel in terms of what are the analysis for efficiency. How would we actually measure the efficiency improvements? What would go into that calculation? And therefore, some of the discussions we've had with Highways England is how to interpret the data that's coming out of the system. And I think one of the things, we have learned a lot of lessons around that. I think we're much better placed now to go into RIS2, that if and when RIS2 goes ahead and the efficiency target is set, and we've given the government our advice on what the efficiency level should be in the future, but we think we'll be in a much better place to monitor Highways England's delivery of those efficiency improvements than we probably all were, frankly, in RIS1. I don't think that's necessarily a massive criticism of anybody, it's just the way things were. All I would just add, just on the other point, is that I just go back again on the lessons learned. I think we've got quite a few years' experience now in terms of Highways England's capability to deliver schemes, to deliver certain types of mixers of schemes, and I think all that's gone into the advice around RIS2. Now, whatever comes out of it, again, there's a lot to draw on in terms of what's happened in RIS1, and one of the successes of RIS1 was undoubtedly, I think Steve mentioned, was a change control, because it's one, you always have to make changes to a program. It's very rare that any major infrastructure programs have no change at all, but the key is to do it transparently, clearly, know what you've agreed to, follow it through, monitor it, because then we all know where we were, and I think that has been a big step forward.
What are the punishments available to you if they're not doing things that you think they should be doing? What's the, when people say, what's the point in fining a big, company that's using public money, for example? Or is it much more about sort of regular meetings and you coming to a compromise? How does that side of things work?
Absolutely. So there is a genuine point of principle, and it applies to Highways England and it applies to Network Rail, that you have public companies. So if you find them, you're not hitting private shareholders, you're hitting the shareholder, who is the government. So in a sense, what is gained by that? And the way we do have the power to define the company, we've always been very clear that this is more of what I would call a last resort. This is not something we immediately reach to. It's a lot of people are so interested in wanting to see companies fined. I mean, I'm regularly asked, why don't you fine Network Rail? Why don't you fine Highways England? There's a lot of interest in just the concept of fines. That's not really the way we see it. The way I see it, it's more about compliance with that performance spec that I put up earlier on. How do you get compliance with the performance spec? And the way you do that is by forward-looking monitoring. Are you likely to hit those targets, yes or no? If it looks like you're not likely to hit those targets, then it's early challenge. What can you do to increase the chances that you're going to hit that target? And it's that challenge and dialogue with Highways England that is the best way of in sense of getting the right result, rather than fines.
Steve, what do you think? Do you think there's enough at stake for a big company like Highways England if they're not getting it wrong?
I think that fining publicly owned companies is completely stupid for all the reasons that we've just heard. I think that seeing success rewarded and failure picked up in the reward scheme for the board of Highways England is a different matter. And if we're really looking at incentivisation, which is what we're talking about here, rather than taking money away from the Department of Transport and doing what with it, I don't really get that. But a censure from the ORR really matters, and I think really this comes to reputation. I don't think anybody working in Highways England wants anything other than the best reputation for being the best road management company that you can possibly be, and that means I think it hurts when you're hurt financially, but it's going to hurt if you're criticised in the media by the people whose task it is to check whether you're doing your job.
Anthony, where do you stand on punishments?
It's funny, isn't it? There's a kind of public desire to see other people punished. It's always an interesting one. I think there's a lot to do here with trust. I think organisations like Highways England, because they are a monopoly, they have to have the trust of their users, and gaining and earning that trust and keeping it is absolutely crucial, because once you lose that trust, it's incredibly difficult to get it back and to operate. And I think Steve's right, having the senior team incentivised along happier customers is a really good thing, and that money should change hands on the basis of that, because that's a good incentive. But it is a lot to do with reputation, and a lot to do with that reputation is the feedback loop.
So the number one question you ask as a journalist is, did you take your bonus this year? So every chief executive has to be ready for that one, I think. We'll move on to RIS2. We've got a good question about RIS2, which I'll bring into this as well. It's a bit worrying, really, the tone around RIS2, the sense that, is it going to happen? People even questioning it. We certainly weren't getting that last year. I mean, how serious is the sort of threat, do you think, Steve?
Well, I think that we've all seen, I mentioned in what I said earlier, the rise in concern about the environment, about climate change, in particular CO2. We know that traffic is a particular contributor to CO2 with tailpipe emissions. We've got over 30 million cars on the road in this country, the vast majority of which are fossil fueled. So I do think there's a risk that a new government that potentially could be a coalition, I suspect it wouldn't be a Green Party government, but it could well be a government in coalition with a particular environmental slant. And they could come in and at the very least pause and want to have a think about how much they are prepared to commission over the next 5 years. And my plea, I guess, to them would be for everything apart from the enhancement programme, could we not have the certainty for that? Because we're not about to start closing roads down, I don't think. We're not about to stop needing the network, which, as Anthony said, is absolutely mission critical to our freight and logistics industry. So I hope, actually, that a new government will form quickly and that government will say, this is a good framework, let's crack on.
Anthony, what difference do you think the election could make?
I think whatever government of whatever colour gets in, they're going to come in and face the fact that Britain's got to keep moving, and that means some decisions have to be made about the road network, and those decisions about the road network have a massive impact also on the people's choice and about whether they're going to choose rail or choose bus as well. So this whole thing needs to be seen together. I think Steve's right in terms of air quality. There are debates about public transport and the funding of public transport and how much it costs and how much money goes into it to allow people to choose public transport maybe. And I think on the road network, there's some really tough choices coming up about capacity. When you look at the recent study on the so-called southwest quadrant of the M25, this huge document of thousands of pages concluded it's full, it's going to get fuller, and that's even before you build a new runway at Heathrow. So what on earth is going to happen? Is it going to grind to a sort of 5-mile-an-hour crawl? It's not. Something's got to be done. There's got to be some quite dramatic thinking about road capacity and how it's allocated and the choices that then are afforded to consumers. Because otherwise, we are going to grind to a halt.
Well, you make a very good point there, so I'm going to bring in the first question, which is on similar lines. So it's from Alison. I've got to take the glasses off to read it. I'm of that kind of age now. Could more be done with public transport providers to develop reliable integrated transport solutions into the MRN and SRN enhancement programs, which deliver real alternatives for car owners to ultimately reduce vehicle numbers? So could more be done to talk to public transport providers and integrate it more? Anyone is free to have a tackle of that one.
Well, I'll start if you like. So I think the honest answer is there's always more that can be done. There's always potential to be explored. I think in this instance...
Testing 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3.
Okay, John, are you on?
Am I on?
Can anyone sign?
Yeah.
Right, do you want to... there we go.
Okay.
Old school.
Okay, so what I was saying was there's always scope to do more. When we're thinking about public transport, we very often think first about the railways and perhaps not enough about buses, something Anthony and I have talked about before, but also we need to think about the coach. And coach travel is significant. It is clearly dependent on the Highways England network. And maybe there, I mentioned in my presentation, the scope for reimagining what a motorway service area is. Maybe there is more scope for shared transport, possibly car shared transport, but also thinking about a greater intensity perhaps of coach traffic, particularly when the time comes that the technology for cleaner power is available for the bigger, heavier vehicles like coaches.
Where does the drive for this change come from, though? I mean, at Highways England, or you might not know, but going out and talking to some of the public transport providers, is there a dialogue there at the moment?
Well, it's very hard for me to say what Jim and Elliot are actually getting up to, and I'd be only too happy for them to nod or something so that I knew. But I think that the push would really come from, I'll call it the customer, but in that sense, it will come from government. It will come from the Department for Transport, DEFRA, the Joint Air Quality Unit, possibly, saying this is what we would like to happen. One of the good things I didn't actually mention that came out of the framework we set up in RIS1 was the dedicated funds for environment and the like. And I think some indication that perhaps one of the outputs we would like from the dedicated environment fund would be an improved public transport offer would certainly be a prompt to make those conversations happen.
John? I think you
My
might
mic
be...
on?
No, you're on, I think.
Am I?
Yeah.
Okay, right. So, just add one thing to that. There's an area where there is more scope, and that we've already seen this happening, and that's the relationship between when Network Rail's planning work and when Highways England's planning work in particular parts of the country, and the coordination around those plans and the communications around those plans. Because as Network Rail, which is an enormous organisation, has become more devolved, more regionally devolved, what we've seen is better communication at the local level between Network Rail and Highways England. And I think that does have an impact on users. It does give people more informed choices, and I think that could be taken quite a bit further.
How good are we in a bigger picture of coming with the integrated transport? I remember as a sort of rookie reporter interviewing John Prescott by a river taxi on the Thames, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, something like that, and he was going on about integrated transport policies then, and we're still talking about it now.
I think there's a slight danger of some of these debates about getting focused on a kind of hyper-mobility that a few number of people do. Most car users never go near a train or a bus. Most bus users never go near a train. Most train users never go near a bus. You know, it's horses for courses. People are choosing the transport that they want. Yes, of course, there's more you can do on integration, but the railways are pretty full in the peak already. The key area, I think, is bus and coach. That's where there's flexible, easier expansion, assuming you've got the road space. Don't forget, outside, even in London, bus use is declining. It's been in a fairly long-term decline for a whole host of variety of reasons. But I think that gives you a clue as to where the intervention is going to come from, if you're going to provide people with really viable different choices.
That's interesting, though. So it's kind of like banks. I think my microphone. So it's kind of like banks in a way, where people don't swap over very easily. It's very hard to push people into different forms of transport.
Yes. Once you've bought a car, you've made that significant investment decision. It's sitting there in a drive. It's a sunk cost. You will then compare the cost vis-a-vis public transport on the petrol cost alone, and often it's very unfavourable. You get 3 people in a car, it's totally unfavourable. That's why Uber is very popular at 7 o'clock in the evening. It's a great consumer option. People like it.
Okay, we've got another good question here, actually. It's all good having the prep work for RIS 2, but it needs to be released to the supply chain. So I guess it's a wider question about the sort of relationship Highways England has with the supply chain, how good they are at communicating. And I know basically you don't work for Highways England, so you're guessing somewhat here. But I mean, John, is that something you look at, about how good they are at communicating the work that will need to be done? Because I endlessly hear from people in the supply chain saying, not just with roads, with railways as well, we just need to know what's going on.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fundamental, and part of our deliverability assessment that we did for RIS 2 was based on our understanding of a view of the supply chain and Highways England's engagement with the supply chain. Indeed, we're doing another piece of work at the moment to look at supply chain readiness around RIS 2. So it's fundamental. We do look at it quite carefully. We do focus on it. But obviously I understand that with announcements on RIS 2 delayed, then that's bound to cause some uncertainty. But I think there's a limit to what more I could probably say about that.
There was a very interesting question there about the electric charging network, which I think is worth dwelling on, because there's two big consumer issues there, one of which is how is it going to be planned? Is it being planned? And secondly, who's going to pay for it up front? You know, are all electricity users going to suddenly gleefully stump up for this thing that they may never ever use, even though they might benefit from it? And secondly, what is the consumer experience of the electric recharging system? And there are different systems, so I think they're fairly compatible, but you just get a sense that the fossil fueling network kind of grew up over lots and lots of decades, but now we've got a chance to get this really right. And you know, how are disabled people's views being inputted into the design of the whole recharging system? I think there's a strong consumer voice, which we're hoping to echo and to amplify, is needed in that.
Yes, one of the sessions we're going to be doing over the next 2 days is on electric vehicles and whether there is a business model where you subscribe to a charger company basically and you pay your monthly fee, and how do you know that the chargers are going to be free when you get there and so on. What are your sort of instincts on who will end up funding them? You know, is it going to be public money? Is it going to be can you make enough money as a private company to do that, do you think?
I think you'll end up with a bit of both, won't you? Because there will be parts of the country where there's probably not going to be a very good business case to electrify, and therefore the government's going to have to do something. There'll be parts of the country where there's a really strong business case. At motorway service stations, very strong business case. I suspect you'll end up with government subsidising the last diesel fuel station in the country so that it can still be used in 30 years' time. So it's going to be mixed.
Steve, there's quite a few questions coming in about infrastructure and changing infrastructure. It's not just the roads, it's all the building around it. I think we're going to hear a lot about that this year as well, spatial planning, changing the cities and so on. Do you think there's enough collaboration going on there between like a transport department and a planning department to decide how the cities and the roads are going to look? So, you know, we're moving out of the silo of just building roads.
I think the good news is that there's an awful lot more join up than there has been historically. I think it's fair to say that historically the focus in what we now think of as the Ministry of Housing has been rather more on numbers and rather less on, if you like, the consequences of those numbers of houses and where they're going, which led to any number of arguments. I'm thinking back 15, 20 years now between those proposing developments such as Eastern Quarry down on the Thames and the impact that would have on the A2 and the M2, without at that time thinking in a joined-up way about how the development could be enabled and the traffic kept flowing. So I think we are seeing more of that. I'd like to see more still. I'm very happy to be part of an initiative called Transport for New Homes, and we're discussing with a number of bodies, including with Homes England, how the transport implications of new development need to be thought about right up front. There's no point thinking at the end of the day with transport, as it so often has been, as tail end Charlie, that someone's decided that's where thousands of houses are going to go, and only then does it become apparent that there is no railway, there are no buses running, and nobody wants to start running them because the roads that have been built through the housing estate are too small to get a bus through.
I think sort of matching what planners want with the way people want to live is going to be very, very important. It's quite interesting because I saw somewhere that the biggest complaint among tenants having moved into a new social housing home is about the car parking spaces, because the planners say you can have one. They've got 3 cars. Where do they end up? They end up on the verge, on the village green or whatever. And this is a big shift. If there aren't viable alternatives, people will bring their cars and park them. And I think that sort of planning is getting better. And it's interesting, near us, that where I live, there's 2 big developments, one granted in 2012 with a huge number of car parking spaces in London, and one granted last year where there's no car parking spaces and people can't even have a controlled parking zone permit. So it's literally no car.
I think it's
big change
for workplaces as well, isn't it? I think, you know, those limited parking spaces, and there are developments in London now where they're expecting 50% occupancy. So actually, you know, people aren't even going to be going into the office as much anymore. There's a question here. It's very political, but it's the inevitable one about smart motorways. It just says, what's happening with the smart motorways programme? I know there's a review going on at the moment, isn't it, with the government? So, John, how long might that take? Do we know, and what might come out at the other end of it, as much as you can tell us?
I think there's to be honest, there's probably a limit to what I can say here. That, as you know, there is, as you say, there is a government review on. We are feeding the information that we have into that government review, and I think it's government's job to decide how to follow that up when we get a new government in place. So it's just a limit to what I could probably say.
You two guys are a bit freer on what you can say. So what could come out of a government review? Might they just say stop them, design them in a completely different way? I mean, what might happen, Steve? What do you think?
Well, I have some experience of government reviews, as you know, and I think the outcome can be the full range. So it is entirely plausible that once the new Transport Secretary, let's face it, it might be Grant Shapps, but it's quite likely to be somebody else, will receive the benefit of the review that Grant has commissioned, and they could decide they want to pause. But I think probably more likely what happens in these instances is that there are aspects of the design that could be revisited. We've heard a lot of calls for the spacing of refuges to be closer together, for the design of refuges to be much clearer, so they're now bright orange, but maybe more could be done again, not just to make them very visible when you're within eyesight of them, but also to make people more aware of how far they are away from the next one. With signs, I think that there are really design-based things that might come out of the review that might make people feel more comfortable. I have to say one of the other things that could come out is a bit more information about quite how unsafe being on the hard shoulder is. One of Highways England's problems is that far too many people stop on the hard shoulder for not emergency breakdown reasons with the vehicle failing, but for sort of silly things like letting the children do a wee or to consult a map. And as someone said earlier on, the hard shoulder is not a place we want people to be.
Yeah, Anthony.
I think pragmatically, I mean, is the government going to strip out the smart motorway all running lanes? Is it going to stop building them? I think when you've got rises in traffic, which is unconstrained, it would just result in slower journeys, less reliable journeys. That's politically very unattractive. I suspect what will come out of the review is a much greater focus on telling people what's happening on these smart motorways, the level of information, what happens when you break down, don't go under a red X. And then the techie things about the underfloor detection and that, this is happening and is being spread throughout the network, so it's more clearly being visibly managed and users are being kept much more in the loop.
How did that message not get out there in the first place? Because, every press release I got through just said, it will be safe, it will be safe. Why do people think they're not safe?
People aren't listening. People have got busy lives. They're trying to drive somewhere to pick the kids up or play badminton or whatever. I mean, there's a whole raft of information that's thrown at you. You don't listen until you think it's useful or you really need to. And so I think the targeting of that information and the volume of it and the repetitiveness, without it becoming tedious old public information adverts, which we don't like, is just absolutely crucial.
Part of this, Richard, is a carrot and stick thing. So the first thing we have to remember is that there are 38 million people in this country with a full driving licence. The vast majority of those people passed their test before even the first trial of all-lane running. That's the last time they read the highway code, and whatever I might think about it, they have no current plans to read it again. So I think that there is more to be done to put information out there, but the stick end, at the moment, we've been waiting for red X penalties to come in, and I think at the point when people start getting something that isn't a warning letter, but is a penalty, that information will really start picking up, because people will suddenly find that they know someone who's had a penalty, and they'll be only too ready to talk about it. And we all know we tend to take information much more readily from other people that we know rather than the Transport Secretary.
Well, guys, thank you very much for your fantastic insights. Steve, thank you again for stepping in. You're up again in the next session, aren't you, on the Subnational Transport Boards, which is going to be at 11:45. Thanks for your questions, and hopefully you can join us in 45 minutes. And please thank our panel.